May 27, 1941. Just before 9 o'clock in the morning, somewhere in the grey Atlantic, roughly 400 nautical miles west of the French coast, a young German gunnery officer stands inside an armoured control station high on the superstructure of the largest warship Europe has ever sent to sea. His name is Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg. He is the fourth gunnery officer of the battleship Bismarck. Through the slit of his rangefinder, he can see the horizon lighting up in flat orange flashes. British battleships. King George V to one side, Rodney to the other. They are firing full broadsides into a ship that cannot run and cannot turn. He has been trained for this exact moment for years. He knows the mathematics of naval gunnery better than almost anyone alive. He can calculate range and bearing and the fall of shot. And yet the one question turning over in his mind is not a question of mathematics. It is a question of disbelief. How did it come to this? How is the most powerful battleship in the world sitting here, steaming in a slow, helpless circle, waiting to be executed? He knows the answer, and the answer makes no sense to him. The answer is not another battleship. The answer is not a torpedo from a submarine. The answer is a single canvas-covered biplane, an aircraft made largely of fabric and wire and wood, an aircraft so slow and so old-fashioned that its own crews joked it belonged in a museum. One torpedo, from one obsolete little aeroplane, has doomed 50,000 tons of German steel. Pause on that, because this is not really a story about a ship. This is a story about what happens when a nation decides that size and steel and pride are the same thing as strength. This is a story about how the newest technology in the world was undone by the oldest. And it is a story about a small number of men in open cockpits, flying into a gale at little more than the speed of a fast car, who did what fleets of modern aircraft were not asked to do. This is the story of how a fabric biplane crippled the Bismarck. To understand why a German admiral could not explain what had happened, you first have to understand what German admirals believed. And to understand that, you have to understand the ship itself, because the ship was not just a weapon. It was an argument made in steel. It was the German Navy telling the world, and telling itself, exactly who it thought it was. The Bismarck was laid down at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg on July 1, 1936. She was launched on February 14, 1939, and the granddaughter of the old Chancellor Otto von Bismarck smashed the bottle across her bow, while Adolf Hitler himself watched from the dockside. She was commissioned into the German Navy on August 24, 1940, and she was, by almost any measure, magnificent. She was over 820 feet long. She displaced more than 50,000 tons at full load. She was the largest warship any European power had ever built, and she would keep that title until the British battleship Vanguard appeared after the war was over. Her main armament was 8 15-inch guns, mounted in 4 great twin turrets. The German crew gave those turrets names, in the old tradition, running from bow to stern: Anton, Bruno, Caesar, Dora. Each gun could throw a shell weighing about 1,800 pounds over a distance of more than 20 miles. Around that main battery she carried a dozen smaller guns and a heavy anti-aircraft battery built around 16 guns of 10.5 centimeter caliber arranged in 8 twin mounts along her flanks. Her armored belt, the thick steel skin protecting her vital spaces, was in places well over a foot thick. Her hull was almost entirely welded rather than riveted, which saved weight and added strength, and it was divided into 22 watertight compartments. On her sea trials, she pushed past 30 knots, which for a ship of her size was genuinely fast. To the men who built her and the men who sailed her, she seemed close to unsinkable. That word attached itself to her early, and it never quite let go, and you can understand why. She was new. She was enormous. She was the product of the most advanced heavy engineering culture on the European continent. German naval architecture, German steel, German fire control optics. These were not empty boasts. They were, in their own field, genuinely excellent. But here is the first quiet irony of the story, and it is worth slowing down for. The Bismarck was not quite as modern as she looked. Her armor scheme, the way her protection was arranged, was based on a design philosophy that reached back to the First World War, to the great clash of battle fleets at Jutland in 1916. German designers had learned hard lessons at Jutland, and they had built those lessons into the Bismarck. But warfare had moved on, and it had moved on in a direction the design did not fully account for. The chief threat to a battleship was no longer only another battleship. The chief threat was increasingly the aircraft, and the torpedo dropped from the air. And there was a very specific weakness, one that German engineers actually knew about, because they had seen it before. The steering gear, the rudders. At the very stern of the ship, where the hull narrows, the rudders and the steering compartments were not protected the way the guns and the magazines and the engine rooms were protected. It was difficult to armor that part of the ship without ruining her handling, so it was left comparatively vulnerable. The German Navy had watched a similar vulnerability cause chaos in the First World War. They understood the risk in theory. They accepted it, because in the whole vast surface of a battleship, the rudder was a tiny target, and the odds of an enemy striking that exact spot seemed almost impossibly small. Remember that, a tiny target, almost impossibly small odds. That sentence is going to come back. In the middle of May 1941, the Bismarck was ready for her first real operation. The plan was named Operation Rheinübung, which means Exercise Rhine. The idea was simple and, on paper, devastating. Send the Bismarck out into the wide Atlantic, together with the new heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, and let them fall upon the convoys. Britain lived and breathed by those convoys. Ships crossing from North America carried the food, the fuel, and the war material that kept the country fighting. A battleship loose among them could be a catastrophe. A single ship of the Bismarck's power could scatter a convoy and its escorts and sink merchant vessels almost at will. In command of the operation was Admiral Günther Lütjens, the fleet commander. Lütjens was a serious, austere, highly respected officer. He was an experienced sailor and a capable strategist. He had already taken the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on a successful Atlantic raid earlier in the war, but he was also, by temperament, a fatalist. He carried a certain gloom with him. He had wanted to wait until more heavy ships were available, so that the Bismarck would not go out alone but as part of an overwhelming force. He was overruled. The operation would go ahead now. The captain of the Bismarck herself was a different kind of man. Captain Ernst Lindemann was warm where Lütjens was cold, and beloved by his crew where Lütjens was merely obeyed. Lindemann knew his ship intimately. There would be moments in the days ahead where the two men, the admiral and the captain, would see the situation very differently, and where the difference between them would matter. On May 25, his 52nd birthday, Lütjens made a speech to the crew over the ship's loudspeakers. It was not the kind of speech that lifts men up. He told them, in effect, that the British would gather every ship they had and come for the Bismarck, and that the ship would fight to the end. He spoke of victory or death. Survivors would later say that this speech, delivered by a tired and pessimistic admiral, sank the crew's spirits at exactly the moment they most needed lifting. Morale on the great ship began to slide, and it would keep sliding. So that was the argument in steel. A brand new battleship, immensely powerful, immensely proud, protected everywhere that mattered except one small, almost unhittable spot at her stern, sailing out under a commander who already half expected to die. Now we have to leave the German side of the story and cross the North Sea and meet the weapon that no admiral took seriously. The Fairey Swordfish was, by 1941, an aircraft that seemed to belong to another age entirely. It was a biplane, with two sets of wings, one above the other, braced with struts and wires in a way that looked like a relic from the First World War. Its body was largely fabric stretched over a metal and wooden frame. Its cockpit was open to the sky and the freezing wind. Its landing gear was fixed, hanging down permanently in the airstream. It was designed in the early 1930s. The prototype first flew in April 1934, and the type entered service with the British Fleet Air Arm in 1936, the very same year that the sleek modern Spitfire fighter first took to the air. Set the two aircraft side by side, and they looked like they came from different centuries. The Swordfish was powered by a single radial engine of about 690 horsepower. Its top speed was only around 139 miles per hour, and with a heavy torpedo slung beneath it, flying into any kind of headwind, its actual speed over the surface of the sea could fall far lower than that. It was slow, it was fragile-looking, it was, on every specification sheet, obsolete before the war even began. Its crews loved it anyway, and they gave it a name. They called it the string bag. The nickname was affectionate, and it was clever. A string bag in those days was the loose mesh shopping bag that a housewife carried to market, the kind of bag that could stretch to hold absolutely anything you put in it. The Swordfish was like that. It could carry a torpedo, or bombs, or depth charges, or flares, or a lifeboat, whatever the mission demanded. It was slow, and it was ungainly, but it was also tough, forgiving, and astonishingly reliable. A good pilot could throw it around the sky at low speed in a way that a faster, heavier aircraft could never manage. It could take off and land on a pitching carrier deck in weather that would ground more modern machines. And it had already made history. On the night of November 11, 1940, a force of these same fabric biplanes had flown off the carrier Illustrious and attacked the Italian battle fleet in its harbour at Taranto. In a single night, torpedoes dropped from Swordfish crippled 3 Italian battleships and shifted the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean. Naval officers around the world studied Taranto closely. Among the closest students of that raid were the planners of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who would apply its lessons at Pearl Harbor a year later. The lesson of Taranto was clear for anyone who wished to read it. The aircraft, even a slow and humble one, had become a mortal threat to the battleship. But a lesson available to everyone is not the same as a lesson learned by everyone. Here is the deeper contrast, and it is the heart of this story. The German Navy had built its hopes around the individual big ship, the magnificent Lone Raider, power concentrated in steel and guns. The British, by 1941, had been forced by hard experience into something different. They thought in terms of combined arms, battleships and cruisers and destroyers, and, crucially, aircraft carriers, all working together as a web. No single British ship could match the Bismarck gun for gun, but the Royal Navy did not intend to fight her one-on-one. It intended to catch her in a net, woven from many different kinds of ship, and the most surprising strand in that net would be the oldest and slowest aircraft in frontline service. If you are enjoying this deep dive into one of the most extraordinary chases in naval history, a single tap on the like button genuinely helps this kind of long-form history reach more people. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal. Now let us follow the net as it begins to close. The Bismarck and the Prince Eugen slipped out into the Atlantic in the 3rd week of May. The British knew they had sailed, and a desperate hunt began across a vast and empty ocean. On the night of May 23, British cruisers found the 2 German ships in the Denmark Strait, the cold passage of water between Iceland and the ice edge off Greenland. They shadowed them through the darkness, radioing their position back to the fleet. At dawn on May 24, the trap seemed to spring perfectly. 2 of the most famous ships in the Royal Navy came racing in to intercept. One was the battleship Prince of Wales, brand new, so new that civilian workmen were reportedly still aboard fixing her guns. The other was the pride of the entire British fleet, the battlecruiser Hood. For 20 years the Hood had been the largest warship in the world. A symbol of British sea power sailed to every corner of the globe. To the British public she was simply the mighty Hood. She was beautiful, she was famous, and she was loved in a way that few machines have ever been loved. She was also old, and she had a fatal flaw. As a battlecruiser she had been built for speed, and to gain that speed she had sacrificed armor, especially the horizontal deck armor that protects a ship from shells plunging down from long range. The battle that followed lasted only minutes. The German gunnery was fast and superb. A salvo from the Bismarck struck the Hood near her rear magazines, where the ammunition for her guns was stored. The plunging shells found the weakness in her deck. There was a colossal explosion. A pillar of flame shot hundreds of feet into the air, and the mighty Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, broke in two and sank in about 3 minutes. She took 1,415 men down with her. 3 survived. Only 3, out of that entire crew, were pulled alive from the freezing sea by a British destroyer. Take that in for a moment. 3 men out of more than 1,400. The shock in Britain is difficult to overstate. It was as if a mountain had crumbled. The Prince of Wales, damaged and with her new guns malfunctioning, was forced to break off and retreat behind a smokescreen. But she had not fought for nothing. In those few furious minutes, she had landed 3 heavy shells on the Bismarck, and one of those shells did something that would prove far more important than anyone yet realized. It punched into the German battleship's bow and ruptured fuel tanks. The Bismarck began trailing a long, telltale ribbon of oil across the sea, and she began, slowly, to lose access to her own fuel. When the news of the Hood reached London, the response was immediate and absolute. The order came down through the entire Royal Navy, in words that have never been forgotten. Sink the Bismarck. Every available warship, from every direction, was to converge and hunt the German battleship down. It became, for a few days in May 1941, the single most important objective of the British Empire. Directing the pursuit was Admiral John Tovey, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, flying his flag in the battleship King George V. From the far south, racing up from Gibraltar, came a second group of ships known as Force H, under Vice Admiral James Somerville. And Force H included the one type of ship that would matter most of all. It included an aircraft carrier. Her name was Ark Royal. Admiral Lutyens, aboard the Bismarck, now made a series of decisions under enormous pressure. Because of the fuel leaking from that ruptured bow and the loss of fuel he had already suffered by not fully refueling before the operation, he could no longer roam the Atlantic freely. He decided to send the Prinz Eugen off on her own to continue raiding, while he turned the wounded Bismarck toward the occupied French coast, toward the port of Saint-Nazaire, where there was a dock large enough to repair her. If he could reach France, under the protection of German air power and submarines, he would be safe, and the Bismarck could sail again. For a terrifying stretch of hours, he very nearly made it. In the early morning of May 25, the shadowing British cruisers lost contact. The Bismarck simply vanished from their instruments. Lutyens executed a wide, curving turn that carried him clear of his pursuers, and for a while the Royal Navy was searching in entirely the wrong direction, chasing a ghost across empty water. The most powerful battleship afloat had slipped the net. And then, in one of the strange twists that fill this story, Admiral Lutyens threw his advantage away. Apparently believing he was still being tracked, and perhaps wishing to report to his superiors, he broke radio silence and sent a long signal. The British listening stations caught it. Direction-finding equipment fixed on the transmission and gave the fleet a rough bearing. It was not precise, and in the confusion the British at first plotted it poorly and steamed the wrong way for hours more. But the mistake was eventually caught, and the search was redirected. The hunt was back on, though now it was a race against time and against fuel, because the pursuing British ships were burning through their own reserves, and the Bismarck was slipping closer and closer to the safety of the French coast and its umbrella of aircraft. By the morning of May 26, the situation was desperate for the British. If they could not find and slow the Bismarck within hours, she would reach a zone where German bombers could savage the pursuing fleet, and she would escape into port. Everything now depended on finding her again, and on finding some way to slow her down before the battleships could close for a final fight. The finding came first, and it came from the air, from a long-range flying boat far out over the ocean. At about 10 in the morning on May 26, a Catalina flying boat, operating with a British squadron, spotted the unmistakable shape of the Bismarck cutting through the swell far below. It was a crucial sighting. It relocated the lost battleship and told the fleet exactly where their quarry was. There is a small, almost secret detail hidden inside that moment, and it is a true one. At the controls of that Catalina at the instant of the sighting was not a British pilot at all. He was an American, an ensign in the United States Navy named Leonard Smith. The United States was still officially neutral in 1941, still months away from Pearl Harbor. Yet American officers were quietly flying alongside the British, helping to operate these American-built flying boats. Britain, understandably, credited the sighting publicly to the British captain of the aircraft, keeping the Americans' role quiet so as not to embarrass a neutral nation. But it was an American's hands on the controls when the Bismarck was found. History turns on such quiet, unrecorded details. The Bismarck was found, but finding her was not enough. She was still faster than some of her pursuers, and she was drawing near to safety. The heavy British battleships, King George V and Rodney, were still too far behind to catch her before she reached the French coast. There was only one force in a position to reach out and touch the German ship in time. It was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, and the only weapon she could throw across that closing distance was her squadrons of slow, fabric-covered swordfish. Understand what was being asked of these men. They were to fly obsolete open-cockpit biplanes off the heaving deck of a carrier in the middle of a full Atlantic gale. The sea was so violent that the flight deck of the Ark Royal was pitching up and down through more than 50 feet. Spray was breaking clean over the front of the flight deck. In those conditions, no sane air force in the world would have launched anything. The Fleet Air Arm launched anyway, because there was no alternative, and because the Swordfish, uniquely, could just about be flown in weather that would destroy a faster aircraft. Before we reach the strike that mattered, we have to tell the truth about the strike that went wrong, because it very nearly ended in disaster, and because it explains why the second attempt succeeded. There had already been one Swordfish attack on the Bismarck days earlier. On the night of May 24, 9 Swordfish had flown from another carrier, the Victorious, led by an officer named Eugene Esmond. They had pressed home their attack in bad weather and scored a single torpedo hit. That hit struck the Bismarck's thick armored belt and did little serious harm, though it added to the strain on the ship. Remarkably, all 9 of those aircraft found their way back to their carrier in the darkness. Keep the name Eugene Esmond in your mind. His courage that night was only a shadow of what he would later give. Now, on the afternoon of May 26, the Ark Royal launched her first strike against the Bismarck, and it went catastrophically wrong in a way that could have been a tragedy. The weather was so thick, the clouds so low, and the visibility so poor that the Swordfish crews became confused about which ship below them was the enemy. A British cruiser named the Sheffield had been sent racing ahead to shadow the Bismarck and keep her in sight. The Swordfish crews did not know the Sheffield was there. Through gaps in the cloud, they saw a large warship, and they attacked it with torpedoes. They were attacking their own side. The Sheffield's crew watched in horror as British torpedoes came running toward their own hull. The captain threw the ship into violent turns, and then something extraordinary happened. Something that saved the Sheffield and, though no one knew it yet, doomed the Bismarck. The torpedoes had been fitted with a modern type of firing mechanism, a magnetic pistol, designed to detonate the warhead as it passed beneath a ship, where the damage would be worst. That mechanism was unreliable. Many of the torpedoes aimed at the Sheffield exploded prematurely, harmlessly, when they hit the disturbed water. Others ran wide and were dodged. Not one struck home. The Sheffield escaped without damage. As the Swordfish turned away, one crew signaled a rueful apology to the ship they had nearly sunk. It was an embarrassing, almost farcical failure, but it taught the air crews a priceless lesson in the space of a single afternoon. Those magnetic pistols could not be trusted. So when the Swordfish returned to the Ark Royal and were rearmed and refueled for a second attempt, their torpedoes were fitted with the older, simpler contact pistols instead, the kind that detonate only on directly striking a ship's hull. It was a small technical decision, made in haste on a pitching hangar deck. It would change the outcome of the entire operation. In the fading light of the evening of May 26, 15, Swordfish took off from the Ark Royal for the second time that day. They were drawn from 3 naval air squadrons, and the strike was led by Lieutenant Commander Trevenant Coode. The weather had, if anything, grown worse. The wind was near gale force. The light was going. The cloud hung low and broken over a heaving grey sea. The men climbed into their open cockpits, took off into the murk, and set out to find and cripple the most powerful battleship in the world, with weapons dropped by hand from aircraft slower than a modern motorcar. They were clever about it. Rather than search blindly, the strike first flew to the cruiser Sheffield, the very ship they had nearly sunk hours before, and used her as a signpost. The Sheffield pointed them toward the Bismarck, a few miles further on. Then the Swordfish climbed into the cloud to make their approach, and here the plan began to fray. Because inside the thick cloud, the carefully organized formation broke apart. The aircraft came down out of the overcast in ones and twos, scattered around the Bismarck, attacking from several directions at once and at different moments, rather than in one clean, coordinated wave. That accidental chaos turned out to be a kind of terrible gift. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft gunners could not concentrate their fire on a single massed formation. Instead, they had to swing their guns wildly from one lone biplane to another as the Swordfish came stumbling out of the clouds from every angle. The sky around the Bismarck filled with flak, with bursting shells and streams of tracer. The German gunners fired with everything they had. And this is the moment the whole story has been building toward. So let us be careful and precise about what actually happened, and about what we can and cannot know. The Swordfish bored in through the storm of fire. They flew low, sometimes so low that their wheels seemed to skim the wave tops, and released their torpedoes into the water and turned away. At least 2 torpedoes struck the Bismarck, possibly a third. 1 or 2 hit her amidships, against that thick armored belt, and once again did little real harm. The armor held, as the armor was designed to hold, but 1 torpedo, dropped by 1 aircraft, ran toward the very stern of the ship, toward the rudders, toward that small, lightly protected, almost impossible target that German engineers had known about and accepted the risk of years before. And it struck home. The explosion tore into the steering compartments at the back of the Bismarck. It jammed her rudders hard over, angled to port, and wrecked the steering gear. In an instant, everything changed. The Bismarck could still steam. Her engines were untouched. Her guns were untouched. Her armor was intact. By every conventional measure, she was still one of the most powerful warships on Earth. But she could no longer steer. With her rudders locked over, she could only turn in a wide, helpless circle. Damage control parties fought their way into the flooded steering compartments and managed to center one of the 2 rudders, but the other was jammed solid and could not be freed. Someone suggested blasting it loose with explosives, but that risked wrecking the propellers, and the idea was abandoned. In the heavy sea, all attempts to steer the vast ship by running her propellers at different speeds failed. The wind and the waves simply pushed her bow back around. And here is the cruelest detail of all. The jammed rudder did not merely stop the Bismarck from escaping, it slowly turned her back toward her enemies. Instead of running for France, she was now crawling in circles, edging back toward the pursuing British battleships that were racing up through the night to finish her. The single torpedo had not just wounded the ship, it had reversed her direction and delivered her to her executioners. Now, a word about who dropped that torpedo, because honesty matters more than a good story. For decades, various men have been credited with the fatal hit. One pilot in particular, a Scot named John Moffat, became widely known late in his long life as the man who sank the Bismarck, and a book was published under that very title. But Moffat himself was always honest and humble about it. He insisted, again and again, that no one could truly know whose torpedo struck the rudder. The attack was scattered, the light was failing, the aircraft came in from many directions, and it was over in moments. Careful later analysis, including study of the wreck itself on the floor of the Atlantic, suggests the fatal torpedo struck the starboard side near the stern, and only a small number of the attacking crews approached from that side. So the credit likely belongs to one of a very few men. But the exact name is genuinely uncertain, and any honest account has to say so plainly. What is not uncertain is that 15 crews in obsolete biplanes flew into a gale and into a wall of fire, and that between them they landed the blow that doomed the ship. Every one of those 15 aircraft, riddled though some were with holes, made it back to the Ark Royal. Not a single swordfish was shot down. Hold on to that fact, because it sits at the very center of the mystery. 15 slow, fabric-covered biplanes attacked the most heavily gunned battleship in the world, in daylight fading to dusk, and the Bismarck's enormous anti-aircraft battery failed to destroy even one of them. To the German admirals and gunnery officers who survived, this was almost incomprehensible. It became the puzzle at the heart of the disaster. How could it happen? How could the finest naval gunners in the world, aboard the newest battleship afloat, fail to knock down a single antique aeroplane? For years, one explanation has been repeated so often that it has hardened into legend. The story goes that the swordfish was simply too slow. The idea is that the Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire control, the sophisticated system that calculated where to aim, had been designed on the assumption that enemy aircraft would be fast, modern machines. When the shells were fused and aimed to explode where a fast aircraft would be, they burst far ahead of the crawling swordfish, which simply had not arrived yet. The guns, in this telling, kept missing in front, because the biplanes were flying so absurdly slowly that they broke the mathematics of the defense. It is a wonderful story. It is elegant, it is ironic, and it may contain a grain of truth, but the honest answer, based on careful modern study, is that this neat explanation is not proven, and on its own it is almost certainly too simple. The reality was messier, and in a way, more interesting. The failure of the Bismarck's air defense that evening came from many causes stacked one on top of another. Consider what was actually working against the German gunners. Her heavy anti-aircraft guns were mounted in two different patterns, an older type toward the front and a newer type toward the rear, and the two types did not work together smoothly under one fire control system. The stabilized directors, the instruments meant to keep the guns aimed steadily despite the rolling of the ship, were in some respects inadequate or incomplete, a problem traced partly to equipment that had been diverted away before the ship was finished. The sea that evening was a howling gale, and a violently rolling deck makes accurate anti-aircraft fire extremely difficult. The light was failing, and the swordfish kept vanishing into and out of the low cloud, giving the gunners only fleeting glimpses to shoot at. Some of the biplanes flew so low that the heavy guns could not depress far enough to aim at them, and the mountings could not swing fast enough to track an aircraft weaving in close. And finally there was the strange toughness of the swordfish itself. Its fabric skin meant that many shells and cannon rounds passed straight through the aircraft without finding anything solid to detonate against. Machines that should have been torn apart came home full of neat holes, still flying. So the aircraft's slowness may indeed have played some part, at the margins, especially in that its speed over the ground was pitifully low as it flew into the teeth of the gale. But it was one factor among many, not a magic key. The deeper truth is that the Bismarck went to sea with an air defense system that was, in crucial ways, unfinished and untested against exactly this kind of attack. The German Navy had poured its genius into guns meant to fight other ships, and had treated the threat from the air as an afterthought. It sent a magnificent battleship into the Atlantic with no aircraft carrier of its own to protect it, trusting in steel and heavy guns against a danger it had never fully taken seriously. The men in the fabric biplanes exposed that gap in a single evening. There is one piece of testimony worth repeating with care. Ludovic Kennedy, who later became a famous broadcaster and writer, was a young officer aboard a British destroyer during the chase, and he wrote the classic account of the operation. He recorded that a German survivor told him afterward they simply could not believe any aircraft could fly as slowly as the Swordfish did, and that their shells kept bursting ahead of the crawling machines. It is a striking memory, and it lends real weight to the legend. But it is one man's recollection of another man's words, remembered years later, and it is not the same as a cold, technical report. The wise thing is to hold both truths at once. The slowness of the Swordfish astonished the Germans and may have helped confuse their aim. And the deeper cause of the failure lay in a whole stack of German shortcomings in equipment, doctrine, weather, and light. The legend is not a lie, it is just far too small to hold the whole truth. Whatever the precise reasons, the outcome was fixed. As night fell on May 26, the Bismarck was steaming in circles, unable to steer, waiting for the dawn and the enemy she could no longer escape. Aboard the ship, the mood collapsed into a grim, fatalistic despair. Admiral Lutyens sent a signal that captured it exactly. He reported that the ship was unable to maneuver and declared that they would fight to the last shell, ending with words of loyalty to Hitler. The men aboard now understood what their admiral had perhaps expected from the beginning. They were not going to reach France. They were going to die at sea. Through that long night, the Bismarck was given no rest. A flotilla of British destroyers had caught up with the crippled giant, and they harried her in the darkness. These were small, fast ships, including vessels crewed by sailors from across the Commonwealth and one manned by Polish sailors who had escaped their conquered homeland to keep fighting. They darted in and out of the gloom, firing torpedoes and gunfire, keeping the exhausted German crew at battle stations all night long. They did little serious physical damage, but they denied the Bismarck's men any sleep, any calm, any moment to recover before the final reckoning. The reckoning came with the daylight. On the morning of May 27th, the heavy British battleships finally arrived. Admiral Tovey, in King George V, together with the older but heavily armed battleship Rodney, closed in on the circling Bismarck. Tovey had deliberately waited for full daylight so that his gunners could see clearly. Just before 9 o'clock in the morning, the British battleships opened fire. What followed was not truly a battle. It was closer to an execution, and many of the British sailors who witnessed it later said as much, with no joy in the saying. Because the Bismarck could not steer, she could not maneuver to spoil the enemy's aim or bring her own guns properly to bear. The British battleships, free to position themselves as they pleased, hammered her with broadside after broadside. Rodney, with her heavy guns, closed to shockingly short range and fired into the German ship almost point blank. Within about half an hour, the Bismarck's mighty main guns, the pride of German naval engineering, had been battered into silence, their turrets wrecked or jammed. The ship became a burning, broken shambles, still afloat, still flying her flag, but no longer able to fight back in any real way. The end was terrible. Shells tore through the superstructure and the decks. Fires raged. Men were killed in their hundreds. The gunnery officer whose disbelief opened this story, Mullenheim Rechberg, survived inside his armoured station and later described the horror of those minutes, the ship being pounded to pieces around him while he could do nothing. High on the wreckage, according to survivors, Captain Lindemann stood near the bow. As the ship finally went down, some of his men said they saw him standing there, raising his hand in a final salute to the ship he had loved and commanded. Both Lindemann and Admiral Lutyens died with the Bismarck. By around 10 in the morning, the Bismarck was a floating pyre, silenced but stubbornly refusing to sink beneath the waves. The German crew had set scuttling charges to sink her themselves, and those charges, combined with the terrible battle damage and finally torpedoes fired into her by a British cruiser, sent her over. She rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the Atlantic. There has been argument ever since about what truly sank her, whether it was British shells and torpedoes or the crew's own scuttling charges. Later expeditions to the wreck, lying miles down on the ocean floor, suggest that the battle damage alone would have finished her, but that the scuttling charges hastened the end. In truth, both are correct. The British destroyed her ability to fight, and her own crew and the sea completed the work. The cost in human life was immense, and it deserves to be spoken plainly rather than hurried past. The Bismarck had gone to sea with a crew of more than 2,000 men. When she sank, over 2,000 of them died. British ships moved in to rescue survivors from the freezing, oil-covered water, and they pulled some men aboard. But then came a warning that a German submarine might be in the area. Fearing a torpedo attack on ships that were stopped dead in the water, the British broke off the rescue and steamed away, leaving hundreds of men still alive in the sea behind them. Those men were never picked up. A German submarine and a weather ship found only a small handful of additional survivors the next day. In all, out of a crew of more than 2,000, only around 115 men were saved. It was a catastrophe for the German Navy, on the same terrible scale as the loss of the Hood had been for the British 3 days before. Two great ships, and thousands of young men on both sides, gone in a single week. And this is the part of the story where we should resist the urge to celebrate too easily. The men who drowned in the Atlantic that morning were sailors doing their duty, most of them very young, many of them conscripts, who had no more say in the war than the British boys who had gone down with the Hood. The chase of the Bismarck is often told as a triumph, and in strictly military terms it was a British victory of the First Order. But a victory built on the deaths of thousands of young men, of both sides, is not a thing to cheer. It is a thing to remember soberly and to weigh. Now come back to the question we started with. Why could the German admirals not explain what had happened? The answer is not that the Germans were poor sailors or poor engineers. They were neither. Their gunnery in the Denmark Strait had been magnificent. Their ship was a masterpiece of construction. Their crews were brave and skilled. The answer lies somewhere deeper, in how the two navies thought about war itself. The German navy had placed its faith in the single overwhelming object, the great ship, the concentrated symbol of national power and pride. It built the Bismarck to be the strongest thing on the ocean, and in a straight fight between ships, she very nearly was. But it sent her out to face a British way of war that did not care about single objects. The British had learned, through loss and desperation, to fight as a system. Battleships and cruisers and destroyers and carriers and flying boats and codebreakers, and even a neutral American at the controls of a flying boat, all woven together into one relentless, adapting net. When one strand failed, another held. When the fast modern weapons could not reach the Bismarck in time, the oldest and slowest weapon in the fleet could. That is the real reason a fabric biplane crippled a battleship. Not luck alone, though there was luck. Not a single magic weakness, though the rudder was a genuine flaw. The deeper reason is that the Germans had built the perfect answer to a question the British had stopped asking. The British were no longer asking which ship was strongest. They were asking how many different ways they could bring force to bear on a single point, until one of them found the mark. And so the shining new battleship, unbeaten in gunfire, was undone by an aircraft its designers would have laughed at, launched from a pitching deck into a gale, flown by young men in open cockpits with the freezing spray in their faces. The consequences reached far beyond that one morning in the Atlantic. The loss of the Bismarck shook the German high command to its core. Hitler had never been enthusiastic about risking his great surface ships in the open ocean, and this disaster confirmed his deepest fears. From then on, the giant German warships were hoarded and hidden rather than unleashed. The Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, even more powerful, would spend almost the entire rest of the war lurking in the fjords of Norway, a threat that rarely sailed and rarely fought, tying down British resources but achieving little. The great age of the surface raider, the lone battleship loose among the convoys, effectively ended in the water where the Bismarck went down. The German navy turned instead to the submarine, to the U-boat wolf packs that would come far closer to strangling Britain than any battleship ever did. As for the humble Swordfish, the aircraft that everyone had written off as obsolete before the war even started, it went on to outlive the very machines designed to replace it. It served until the last months of the war, hunting submarines, escorting convoys, doing the patient, unglamorous work of keeping the sea lanes open. The old string bag, slow and fabric-skinned and utterly unfashionable, quietly became one of the most effective and beloved aircraft the Royal Navy ever operated. There is a lesson buried in all of this, and it is worth carrying away. It is easy to mistake the newest and largest and most impressive thing for the strongest thing. It is easy to build a magnificent answer to yesterday's question, and to be proud of it, right up until the moment reality asks a different question entirely. The Bismarck was not defeated because the Germans were foolish. She was defeated because they were certain, and certainty is a dangerous thing to carry into a changing world. The men in the biplanes had no certainty at all. They had a slow old aircraft, a single torpedo each, a gale, and the willingness to fly into fire and find out what was possible. Spare a thought, at the last, for all of them. For the 15 Swordfish crews who took off into that storm, not knowing if they would return, and who between them landed the blow that changed everything. For the officer Eugene Esmond, who led the first swordfish attack against the Bismarck, and who would be killed less than a year later, leading his squadron of the same obsolete biplanes in a hopeless daylight attack against German warships in the English Channel, an act of such extraordinary courage that he was awarded the highest decoration his country could give. For the young sailors of the Hood, 1,415 of them gone in 3 minutes, leaving only 3 behind. And for the more than 2,000 young Germans who went down with the Bismarck, sailors on the losing side of a war most of them never chose, whose deaths in the cold Atlantic are as worth remembering as any. They are all part of the same story now, a story about steel and pride and the limits of both, a story about how the strongest ship afloat was brought to a halt by the frailest aircraft in the sky, and a story about a single torpedo dropped by one of a handful of men whose exact name we will never know for certain, that found a target so small the enemy had judged it almost impossible to hit. If this account brought these men and their machines back to life for you, even for a few minutes, then consider subscribing, because there are many more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories of weapons dismissed as useless that changed history, of impossible odds met by ordinary people, of the strange, humbling ways that wars are truly decided. The Bismarck went down on the morning of May 27, 1941. The men who flew against her and the men who died aboard her deserve not to be forgotten. Remembering them, honestly and completely, is the least that we can do.